speaker tonight is Lee Ellis, Willis. I just wanted to see if he was paying attention. I used to know Lee Ellis, and I think there was a basketball player by the name of Lee Ellis. But anyway, Lee has been just fantastic. I've been here, this is the beginning of my 6th year as the Dean of College of Arts and Science, and I must say that Lee has been a very, very pleasant surprise and member of the College of Letters and Science. I think Lee is a true leader, and he took over his chair at the History Department last year. He's chair of the History Department and professor of history at UWSP. And every time we have a conversation, it's either about athletics or it's about something really fascinating that he's doing in research with the slave trade in the South. And I've always found his talks and our conversations wonderful. A little bit of background on Lee. He got his PhD at the University of, actually Florida State University. Is that the Florida State University? He did his PhD there and got here in 2006, 2007. He has been an assistant professor of history, associate professor of history, and the chair of history since 2007. He took over his chair 2 years ago. He has 2 books that he has published as author and co-author. He's currently working on another book, and the title of that book is The Clandestine Slave Trade in the United States, 1808 to 1861. He's received a variety of grants and awards in the work that he's done. He's from the South, right? Where are you originally from?
Florida.
Well, where in Florida?
Tallahassee.
In Tallahassee. He's from Tallahassee, so that figures. He's a Florida State fan. But he received the Harry T. and Harriet B. Moore Award from the Florida Historical Society in 2012. This book award recognizing outstanding monographs related to Florida's ethnic groups for dealing with significant social issues from a historical perspective. He's received the UW System Fellowship, Research for the Humanities. He was at the Institute of Research in the Humanities in Madison in the 11-12 year, and he's received the Excellence in Teaching Award from the university. He teaches courses in the history of the United States to 1877, the history of the United States since 1877, so he's done both of those. American history to 1877, and, African American history to 1877 and African American history since 1877. Racial and ethnic groups in the United States, the Civil War era, the Age of Jackson, the Black Atlantic, and alcohol and drugs in U.S. history. He's on the board of directors with the Journal of Southern Religion, and he has organizational memberships in the American Historical Association, the Southern Historical Association, the Organization of American Historians, and the Association for the Study of Southern Religion. I usually like to mention something about a faculty member that's off the record. Lee is an outstanding runner, and you may know that. He's in a specific age bracket for running, which I will not mention, but he has still consistently come in at around 4:30 to 4:40 for the mile. Now that 4:30 to 4:40, his most recent was 4:40. I usually try to get about 4 miles in an hour. That's to burn as many calories as I can. But as you can see, Lee has clearly a different genetic line than I do. I mean, this is a football body, that's a runner's body. He actually was a basketball player at college, and he kind of looked like that as well. So I want to welcome Lee to the Community Lecture Series, and I ask you to welcome him as well.
Thanks, Chris, for that glowing introduction. I'm sure I can only disappoint after that. But tonight I want to talk a little bit about the Constitution and some of the vexing issues that the framers of the Constitution had to deal with. And probably none were more vexing than the question of slavery. And interestingly, in the Constitution, you will not see the word slavery ever appear in the original document. But it was there nonetheless, and there was a couple of different issues they had to deal with. But tonight I really want to focus on the international slave trade and what the framers of the Constitution had to say about the international slave trade, whether or not to abolish it and forbid the importation of African-born slaves into the United States, or whether or not just to allow it to continue. And as the title of my talk suggests, they ultimately came to a compromise. And so I want to talk a little bit about the background leading up to the Constitution and the Philadelphia Convention of 1787, and then a little bit of the consequences of the decisions that the framers made that summer in Philadelphia. So I've got a little outline for my talk here, just so you know more or less what I'm going to try to cover. I played around with this talk quite a bit, and I kept taking things out and putting new stuff in, so hopefully it all works together. I want to talk a little bit about really begin with the 1770s, and really the decade before the Constitutional Convention occurred in 1787. And I want to talk about really focus that on the theme of the promise of the Revolution. And how there seemed to be an impulse toward opposing slavery, and it appeared that the colonies, and in all 13 colonies, slavery did exist. It did not play the same role in the economy of these different colonies and later states, but nevertheless it existed in every single one of the 13 colonies that were rebel against Great Britain during the Revolution. But then I want to talk a little bit about the problem of racism in early America, and how many white Americans were reluctant to extend citizenship to people of African descent and the limits of democracy. And then I want to talk about the actual Constitutional Convention itself, what the framers debated, and what they ultimately came up with in terms of how to regulate slavery in the new republic. And then I want to spend the rest of the talk talking about the consequences of their decisions. So in the 1760s and 1770s, as many of you know, I just want to touch base on some of the themes of the American Revolution and how the colonies were drifting toward revolution. And one of the things I want to emphasize is oftentimes left out of sort of larger surveys of the American Revolution is the important role that people of African descent did play in the Revolution and some of the earliest protests of parliamentary acts, such as the Quartering Acts. People of African descent were involved in these protests, in the street demonstrations. Crispus Attucks, one of the first people killed in the American Revolution, part of the Boston Massacre of 1770, was of Native American and African descent, and he was considered one of the first patriots and heroes, martyrs of the American Revolution. Of course, in the Boston Massacre. African Americans were also very keenly aware to a burgeoning anti-slavery movement in the British Empire, and this is really demonstrated in the Somerset case, the James Somerset case of 1772. James Somerset had been born in Virginia. He was of African descent. His master had taken him to Jamaica and then to England. And there, Somerset fled from his master. He sought out abolitionists who would aid his cause, and he sued for his freedom on the grounds that in England, slavery was not a common institution supported by English common law. It was a celebrated case. It was tried in English high courts, and Somerset won. And the judge argued that, yes, English common law does not recognize, or does not have a tradition of slavery. There's no laws to support the institution of slavery, so Somerset must be freed. Within a year after this case, people in Massachusetts wrote freedom petitions demanding their freedom, that based on the Somerset decision, this now applied to all of the colonies. But in reading the full decision, the judge had argued that while slavery had not existed in England, it could possibly have legal tradition in other parts of the empire. And so many of these petitions, of course all of these petitions really were were not well received, but nevertheless they demonstrate the active role that African Americans played in this larger revolutionary movement. There also was a burgeoning opposition not only to the institution of slavery, but to the slave trade. And many people who were reluctant to join the anti-slavery movement conceded that the slave trade, that is the process of kidnapping people in Africa and bringing them to America, was really indefensible. There was very little intellectual argument or any intellectual wiggle room at all to justify this as a humane institution. In early America, there was a young woman, really a prodigy, named Phyllis Wheatley, a young girl who had been captured as a child in Africa and brought to the New World, and she was an enslaved girl to a fairly wealthy Boston family who taught her to read, and she proved to have a real gift with language. She published poetry as a teenager, and many regard her as part of the larger African-American but American literary canon. And in one of her early poems, published in 1772, Phyllis Wheatley wrote about that experience of being captured and brought to America. And she talked about the grief that the slave trade brought to Africa, and specifically talked about her own parents and the grief that they had to have experienced to have lost her at such a young age. So the international slave trade was becoming increasingly a target. And this is not to say that British merchants, Dutch merchants, French merchants didn't remain actively involved in the trade, but there was a growing organized movement against the international slave trade, increasingly publishing anti-slavery pamphlets and tracts. In America, a very prominent slaveholder, you might have heard of him, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, owner of more than 200 slaves. But Jefferson himself had problems with the institution of slavery. And it might be difficult for a modern audience to understand how someone whose status, his influence, and his wealth was produced from slave labor, how he could come out against the international slave trade. But Jefferson believed that, and he, in his publication, A Summary View on the Rights of British North America, from 1774, he blamed the British Empire, and later he would blame the monarchs of Britain for supporting the slave trade and bringing this nefarious traffic to the New World, and that now this was something that was going to have to be dealt with. And as we'll see, Jefferson had a hard time conceptualizing a way around this problem. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Other prominent revolutionary figures, Thomas Paine, came out more stridently against the institution of slavery and the international slave trade. And by 1775, in North America, in Philadelphia, particularly populated by many Quakers, the Society for the Relief of Free Negroes unlawfully held in bondage became one of the first organized anti-slavery societies in America. So in the 1770s, there seemed to be some momentum, a groundswell opposing the institution of slavery. So during the actual War for Independence, some states began moving toward abolishing the institution gradually. Pennsylvania, for example, passed a Gradual Manumission Law, which meant that people were gradually freed over the course of their lifetime. The way it worked was that people born into slavery after 1780 would be freed upon adulthood. I believe the year was 25 or 28, which was hardly humane, but it nevertheless set that state on the course toward becoming a free state, an anti-slave state. In 1783, America witnessed its own version of a Somerset case. A Massachusetts enslaved man named Coke Walker. His unusual first name was a sort of Anglicization of clearly an African ethnic name. And Walker also fled from his master and then sued for his freedom. And Walker and his lawyers relied upon Massachusetts' recently ratified state constitution, which clearly had language that was antithetical to slavery. And Walker, like Somerset, won. And through this court decision, this Massachusetts Supreme Court decision, Massachusetts was on the course toward becoming a free state. There was also, even in the South, where slavery was stronger, a spirit of gradually abolishing slavery. Many masters moved towards abolishing slavery by freeing some of their elderly and sometimes infirm enslaved people in the Upper South, particularly in places like Virginia and Maryland. In the Lower South, there was a trend of slave owners freeing their children. Slave owners oftentimes had children with enslaved women. That was not uncommon. And there was a tendency in the late 18th century, this trend would not continue necessarily into the 19th century, but of masters freeing their children that they had had with slaves. Even prior to the Constitutional Convention, and the United States was organized under a document known as the Articles of Confederation. The Congress that existed at the time, it was a unicameral Congress, only one house, passed the Northwest Ordinance, which forbade slavery in the Northwest Territories. You can see this included what would later become Wisconsin. Territory north of the Ohio River was organized. It was laid out in plats. There were different claims on this land from the existing states, and so this ordinance was designed to kind of shore up those claims and define this area as distinct federal territory. But very importantly, slavery would be forbidden there. And a few years later, they would pass a Southwest Ordinance that would allow slavery south of the Ohio River. But there did seem to be some, again, momentum, a promise of revolution towards truly extending full freedom to all Americans. But as we'll see, there would be limits. And this would lead to some of the needs for a compromise in the Constitutional Convention. Thomas Jefferson, who, of course, was one of the most active and literary of 19th, 18th, and 19th century Americans, wrote extensively about ideals of freedom and liberty, of course, but also the institution of slavery and how it would be antithetical to a successful republic. Jefferson, one of his most proud works, in terms of works that he was most proud of at the end of his life, was his notes on the state of Virginia, in which he wrote extensively about the flora and fauna, the terrain, the geography, but also the people of Virginia. And it's a fascinating document. It's also problematic in many ways because in many ways it was one of the first works of scientific racism. He very clearly lays out what he sees as the limits of a people of African descent contributing to early America. And he argues in this work that there was something biologically different. He doesn't use that term, but he describes obvious physical differences between people of African and European descent, and argues that people of African descent would never truly have the physical capacity, intellectual capacity to be citizens and contributors to American life and American politics. And to Jefferson, that was an enormous problem because he believed that ultimately they could rise up and overthrow the United States, that ultimately what would happen would be a race war. And so this was greatly vexing. And Jefferson's opposition to the slave trade was primarily to prevent this problem from getting worse. And so wanting to end the slave trade and somehow come up with a way of dealing with this problem. And again, I guess I should mention this point. Jefferson's ideal citizen, the sort of the backbone of the American political system and American economy, was the independent farmer, the yeoman farmer, as he styled it. And he just didn't see in his mind a way for people of African descent to become this ideal. And Jefferson would later in his life, toward toward the end of his life, would refer to the institution of slavery as akin to holding a wolf by the ears. It says you don't like it, but you don't dare let go. And he was referring to the possibility of abolition and then enslaved people immediately seeking retribution against their masters. And so to Jefferson, the way to go about the process of abolishing slavery was to find some way to colonize people of African descent outside of the United States. And so I want to kind of lay the groundwork for that, because this will be a consequence of what the framers of the Constitution would decide to do. So as I mentioned, under the first years, during the Revolution, in the first several years of the early Republic, the United States, the 13 colonies that rebelled against Great Britain and ultimately won their independence in 1783, those 13 states were organized fairly loosely under what was called the Articles of Confederation. And one of the problems with the Articles of Confederation was that the national government was too weak. They couldn't deal with problems of the debts incurred from the Revolution. They couldn't deal with competing port cities in different states, passing different tariff rates, competing with one another. And they feared that with too much power vested in state governments, that the union or confederation of these states would soon fall apart. They needed something stronger to tie them together. And of course, this is what led to the need for a revision of the Articles of Confederation, initially with the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. But of course, what the delegates would do is they would really but scrap the Articles of Confederation and write what we know as the Constitution. And in the Philadelphia Convention, they had to deal with a number of things. What this new government was going to look like, what was this president going to do, what was the Congress, the legislative branch going to do, the Supreme Court. And they had to work out a number of different issues, different compromises between the northern states, the southern states, the larger, more populous states, and the smaller, less populous states. But slavery was something that ran through many of these discussions. They're, of course, meeting at a time when the anti-slavery movement and the movement against the international slave trade is getting more organized, more vocal. And they had to deal with a number of things. Of course, most famously was the 3/5 Compromise, which many of us have heard of. And the 3/5 Compromise came out of the need to determine how to establish apportionment for the purposes of representation in the House of Representatives. Larger slave states like Virginia wanted enslaved people to count in this apportionment process. They wanted them to be counted as whole persons so that they would have more seats in the House of Representatives. And ultimately what they came up with was a